Good morning, everybody. How are you? Great, I'm Kathy Beekle. I'm director of the Philanthropy Forum here at GISBIA, which is the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. We're pleased to welcome so many of you on this wintry, windy Wednesday morning. And we're here for a discussion of wildlands philanthropy and the complexities of securing and safeguarding parklands for the long run. And as we'll see and soon discover, the idea of what a park is varies by context and location. So today, we're going to take a very visual and virtual journey from north to south and across time. We'll touch on early philanthropic gifts of families like the Rockefellers that led to the backbone of the national park system. We'll move then in our discussion to mid-20th century efforts and current efforts by a family closer to home, the R.K. Mellon Foundation, who have bought and maintained millions of acres, literally from sea to shining sea. And then we'll look more at a hyper-local example through the lens of the Allegheny County Parks Foundation and the notion of providing recreation and access to some idea of wilderness through a green web network within our own community. And so we'll travel from Pittsburgh and its environs to Patagonia, north and south. And in Patagonia, our speaker will help us see patterns of philanthropy that are maybe familiar to us but different there, and how new public-private partnerships are operating on an unprecedented scale. So the issue of scale will come up time and time again in our discussion. Today's story is the work of our guest speaker, Tom Butler, Vice President of Advocacy, and his organization and the founders of their philanthropy, Tompkins Conservation. Working through a variety of strategies, Tompkins Conservation has secured wildlands for posterity. They've safeguarded species under pressure. They've sustained ecosystems of unparalleled beauty under threat from either development or degradation. A capstone of this work occurred in 2018, when the decades-long dream and the drive of Tompkins Philanthropy resulted in the gift of 1 million acres and the leveraging of 9 million more to create a 10 million acre network of parks and parklands in Patagonia. Taken together, it's a journey that has protected over 14 million acres and preserved wildlife in more than a dozen national parks. As you'll see in a few minutes, the scale of this work spans 2 countries, and it unfolded over 2 different centuries. Its beauty powers the imagination and fuels the soul. It started with the quiet accumulation of land, worked in sustainable agriculture and protection of species. Along the way, it broke new ground, framed new planning methods, and forged new funding models. But it also roiled deep tensions between local economies and global ecology. It opened a rift between local control and national governance. It's instructive, and it's a very instructive story about philanthropic patient capital and the mistrust and contention that can arise over competing views of the public good. So Tom will share that story with us in the opening part of our conversation. The Tompkins programs build on national and local models that we may know more closely associated with work in our community and nationally. Here, the challenge may not only be getting the open spaces, but safeguarding and stewarding their maintenance and sustainability over time. So for that perspective, we'll rely on our 2 respondents to help us anchor the discussion in these more immediate issues in our region and in our country. And we'll rely on respondent Larry Seltzer, President and CEO of the Conservation Foundation, an advisor to foundations like the R.K. Mellon Foundation and others nationally. For more than 3 decades, Larry has worked creatively at the intersection of economic activity and environmental conservation. And then to bring us to the hyper-local perspective, we'll turn to respondent Karen Glotfelty, herself a former policymaker at the state level, a philanthropic leader at the Heinz Endowments, and currently Executive Director of the Allegheny Parks Foundation. Karen can shed light on questions of equity, ecology, and access to open spaces in urban and suburban areas like the regional parks and the emerging green web. How does a post-industrial Pittsburgh embrace open spaces? And then after their response, we'll open it up to your questions for a lively discussion. So with that said, let's go on a journey. It's my specific and great pleasure to introduce Tom Butler, board member, strategist, and vice president of advocacy for Tompkins Conservation. Tom.
Thank you so much for being here. It is a great pleasure. It's also a real honor for me to be sharing this forum with luminaries like Karen and Kathy and Larry. And I look forward to a spirited dialogue and discussion and learning from them and from you in the room. A pointed question: how are you folks doing on your New Year's resolutions? Anybody starting to break them yet? Or mid-February, somebody is starting to break your New Year's resolutions. Well, this year, I avoided resolutions for myself that had anything to do with dietary impulses, with my personal girth or exercise regimen. I decided to go a different direction this year. And my New Year's resolution for 2019 was, whenever I had the opportunity to give a presentation to whatever kind of audience, on whatever, I would incorporate poetry. Any Mary Oliver fans out there? In honor of her passage a few weeks ago into the big wild, let's commence with Mary's words from her poem, Extending the Airport Runway. Mary Oliver writes, "The good citizens of the commission cast their votes for more of everything. Very early in the morning, I go out to the pale dunes to look over the empty spaces of the wilderness. For something is there. Something is there when nothing is there but itself. That is not there when anything else is. Alas, the good citizens of the commission have never seen it. Whatever it is, formless yet palpable, very shining, very delicate, very rare. For something is there when nothing is there but itself. That is not there when anything else is." In that one sentence, Mary Oliver invokes the ineffable quality of wildness, that thing that characterizes wilderness or self-willed land, places where we don't yoke to our will to manage or consume or extract, places where we allow nature to direct the ebb and flow of life. Now, I suspect that most, if not all of us, have had an opportunity to feel, had occasion to try to sense or be in the presence of that formless yet palpable and life-enriching beauty. Maybe you've walked the cobble beaches of Acadia or had occasion to cultivate your own sense of wonder mucking about in the tide pools of the Maine coastline. Or perhaps, being Pennsylvanians, you've had that opportunity to witness the raptor migration from the heights of the Kittatinny Ridge there at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. Or maybe you've strolled among those giant coast redwoods of Muir Woods National Monument. And whether you know the histories, the backstories of these places, whether you know that George Bucknam Dorr exhausted his family fortune and his life's energy helping to create Acadia, or whether you know about Rosalie Edge helping to secure the lands and install the warden to face down the gunners at Hawk Mountain, or whether you know the story of the Kent family, who bought that last remaining primeval grove in the Bay Area to secure it for conservation. And then when it was threatened by eminent domain from a water developer, they did this little bit of philanthropic jujitsu. They donated it. They wrote Teddy Roosevelt and said, "We'll give this if you declare it a national monument under the Antiquities Act and name it for John Muir." So whether or not we know those stories or not, if we've gone to these places, our own personal stories start to intersect with this rich history. We make our own memories in these places. And these protected areas, from Pennsylvania to Patagonia, along with thousands and thousands of others like them, exist only because of what? Of private initiative and funding. That is because an individual or a group, an association of committed people used their time, their money, their influence, their personal energy to protect them. Now, the wildlands philanthropy work of Tompkins Conservation in Chile and Argentina that we're going to talk about this morning is really exceptional in its scale, in its ambition. But it is most definitely not something new under the sun. This tradition of private ownership or a private actor stepping in to secure a natural spectacle stretches back in our history at least until Thomas Jefferson in 1773, when he purchased a natural bridge in Virginia, which he called the most sublime of nature's works. And the Tompkins conservation effort to build on a legacy of park-related philanthropy, even in the region of South America that we're going to discuss, that was almost completely unknown, but that legacy did exist and has contributed to the public good. Francis Moreno, who's sort of the John Muir of Argentina, donated private land in 1904, which was to this nation for a park, was the genesis of Argentina's national park system. And even Chile's most famous, iconic natural area, Torres del Paine, it was expanded by a generous act of wildlands philanthropy in the 1970s. The Italian mountaineer Guido Monzino, who's a climbing pioneer in the Patagonia region, donated his large private estate, his estancia, that was an inn-holding adjacent to the park, to be added to it. So this idea, this approach of acquiring private land and then conserving it as part of the public trust is an old and effective conservation tool, but it was completely unfamiliar to most people and to a broad spectrum of society in the 1990s when two American business people, Douglas and Christine Tompkins, the late Douglas Tompkins, began their large-scale conservation projects in the region. Now, this was a couple that in American outdoor circles was very well known. Doug Tompkins, as a young man, founded a little ski shop and outdoor goods company he called the North Face. And then he sold that, and with his first wife, he co-founded the fashion company Esprit, which was wildly successful. Christine McDivitt was the longtime former CEO of the Patagonia clothing company. And when they got together and married and began doing conservation work in Patagonia, in the region, they effectively turned their entrepreneurial talents to saving wild nature, applying those same skills that had worked so well in business toward developing large-scale conservation projects. This wasn't a totally unfamiliar region. Doug had been visiting the Patagonia area from back to the 1960s for ski race training and for climbing expeditions. But he'd grown up in the Hudson River Valley. And he'd learned to climb as a young guy in the Shwangunks and in the Adirondacks, in the Adirondack Park of upstate New York. And there's Doug, the second from the left with that bold grin and those snazzy red gaiters. And the fellow the other climber who was on the other side of the camera taking this photo was Doug's buddy, Yvonne Chenard. Yvonne Chenard, climbing pioneer, actually hired this young Chris McDivitt when she was in high school. And then she came back after college. She was one of the first employees of the Patagonia company, and she was in on the ground floor helping the Chenard family grow Patagonia into a global brand. So their connection to Patagonia, the place, of course, was quite a natural one. And it's not difficult to understand how one might fall in love with Patagonia, the place. It looks a lot like the American West, where Chris Tompkins had grown up. It looked a lot like places Doug had explored as a young man on his expeditions. But out there in those great waving grasslands, it's not mule deer or herd of elk or bison. Those are guanacos, the wild camel of the region. And also, like the Adirondack Park, where Doug had grown up climbing as a young fellow, this area is also an example of large-scale wilderness recovery or rewilding. Because while we think of Patagonia as this great untouched region at the ends of the earth, actually much of it, including this, the Chacabuco Valley of southern Chile, this landscape of resurgent beauty and exceptional wildness, it's a centerpiece of the Patagonia National Park project. This area had looked like this in 2004, when a Tompkins-led nonprofit had purchased the area's largest private ranch. It was then for sale. It was losing money. It had been overgrazed for a century, heavily eroding landscape, unprofitable for a sheep estancia. And that was the genesis of this effort to launch one of the largest grassland recovery efforts on Earth. And after the property was acquired for conservation, over time, the livestock were sold off, erosion control efforts were implemented, and wildlife recovery programs installed, and subsequent land purchases also added to the conservation holdings there. And over the years, many, many volunteers, including lots of them from the Patagonia Company, came down to spend a couple of weeks working on site in ecological restoration. Folks on their vacation time ripped out more than 400 miles of former ranch fencing, giving wildlife now room to roam. And all of that work was to set the stage for the land's repatriation to the public, for its eventual donation to the state when the privately assembled conservation lands would be added to two adjacent existing national reserves, and the whole thing upgraded to national park status. Now, you can see, of course, that this isn't a bad place to go visit. And I've been fortunate to do that a number of times over the years. Of course, it's all work. When I tell my wife it's January in Vermont and I'm going to summer in South America, honey, it's all work. What can I do? I gotta go. But it's a kind of a nice place, even though I've been there for work, to occasionally try to get out for little adventures. And thus begins my tale. I'll tell you, once upon a time, not too long ago in this landscape, I spent a day afield hiking with three companions, all of which are very skilled and two of which are professional nature photographers. And for some reason, they kept wanting to stop and take photos. So I had most of that day to myself, alone with this scenery, with the bird song and the guanacos for company. And as dusk neared, we set up camp near a little patch of trees, and we didn't bother with the tents. It was a clear night, and it was a beautiful day in Patagonia. The weather's always perfect there, as you may have heard. And we set up, just threw our sleeping bags down on the ground, and this was the sky that night. This was the spectacle we witnessed. And this little patch of trees we knew in this area, where the forest lands were occupied by huemul deer, which is this shy, forest-dwelling and imperiled South Andean deer of the region. We also knew that this region where we were throwing our sleeping bags down on the ground is home to mountain lions. And my biologist colleagues there in the park have been conducting a long-range study of the interactions between the huemuls and the guanacos and the pumas to understand whether this large and expanding and protected population of large cats is negatively affecting the imperiled population of deer. Because that deer is globally imperiled, and it's estimated that about 10% of the entire population of the huemul left on Earth is in the Patagonia Park area. It's also sort of the bald eagle of Chile. This is the animal that's on the national shield, so it's truly a wildlife icon for Chile. So again, after a decade of monitoring, we know a good bit about the prey selection of the local puma population. The good news is they like guanacos. And the good news is they don't eat the huemuls. And we also have a pretty large data set there. We know that they do not eat middle-aged hikers from Vermont. They just don't do that. But it's one thing to know about the data And it's another thing to set your sleeping bag down on the ground and see the shadows begin to lengthen and to know there might be a very large cat haunting those shadows. And to me, that is the essence of a wilderness experience. To be in a place that is self-willed, that is the home to self-willed creatures that are free to flourish in their own ways. And so it was a pleasure to wake up the next morning to this sunrise on San Lorenzo, and also to know that this little group of friends that had camped out, what we had experienced: solitude, spiritual refreshment, companionship with friends, beautiful scenery, abundant wildlife, all those values that we associate with national parks over the last for nearly 150 years now. All of those values will be available forevermore for everyone to experience due to this landmark agreement that Kathy referenced between Tompkins Conservation and the Chilean government that was announced last year.
It's the biggest deal of its kind in history. This is an unbelievable opportunity for conservation and for Chile.
So that was a big day for the Tompkins Conservation Team a year ago. And for those of us who had the pleasure to be there on site and witness President Bachelet signing the decree and Chris Tompkins making her remarks and the Wanakos rolling in the dust in the background, it was really a moving experience. It was really quite something. And we deeply missed the presence of Douglas Tompkins, who was there in spirit. That deal to create the new Patagonia National Park, prompted by this donation in that place of about 220,000 acres, as well as essentially all of our remaining conservation holdings in Chile, that's the roughly million-acre gift, including this place, the other flagship project, Pumalín Park, going with all of the public access infrastructure that we have installed and constructed at Patagonia and Pumalín Parks. That was a deal that was years in the making. And in the last just couple of weeks, that was finally been executed, with the fifth of those new national parks being formally established, the new Kawesgar National Park. Now, a funny thing happened on the way in the year, but in the transition from the former Bachelet government to the current one of Sebastián Piñera, and the former legal process to get this out the door and get everything finalized. And it's quite something that doesn't usually happen in land conservation. We were expecting this Kawesgar National Park to be 6 million acres, the size of Vermont. But when it was announced a couple of weeks ago, it was 7 million acres. They added 1 million. They the government threw in additional fiscal lands. And also, due to the advocacy of the local people, the indigenous Kawesgar people in 13 primarily fishing villages along this coastline, they created also a Kawesgar National Reserve adjacent, covering the fjords lands adjacent to the terrestrial national park, where important economic activity, including local fishing efforts, will continue, but certain kinds of development will be prohibited in that new reserve. So this was really quite a monumental year. But that Chilean Parklands package is part of a larger record of successes creating and expanding national parklands. in collaboration with governments now of several different political persuasions over the years and in partnership with other foundations and conservation advocates, the Tompkins Conservation Team has helped to conserve now upwards of 14 million acres, protected in more than a dozen new and several expanded national parks, as well as other kinds of protected areas. In adding to this terrestrial work, really exciting thing happened in December of this past year. The Congress of Argentina, due to advocacy work by a coalition of actors, including my colleagues in Argentina, the Congress created the country's first 2 marine national parks as part of a system of marine protected areas. And this protected area category of marine national parks did not exist until this last year. We just helped to establish that. Also, just before Christmas of this year, the Argentine Congress officially established the new Ibarra National Park, again from property donated by Tompkins Conservation. This is not in Patagonia. This is in northern Argentina, up in the area closer to Paraguay and Brazil, in the Corrientes province. And it's a landscape of subtropical wetlands, one of the largest freshwater wetlands complexes in South America. If anyone's been to the Pantanal in Brazil, this is sort of the Pantanal of Argentina. It's incredibly rich wildlife habitat, fantastic birding, really a global hotspot for birding. And here, the Tompkins Conservation Rewilding Team has launched probably the most ambitious program of helping to reintroduce missing species and processes into a protected area anywhere in the Americas. My colleagues down there have already successfully reintroduced a variety of species that were extirpated, regionally extinct for decades, including giant anteaters and pampas deer, collared peccaries, and green-winged macaws, among other species. And the capstone of this effort is a project to captive breed jaguars and ultimately release their progeny into the wilds of the Ibarra marshlands. Good news here is that the first 2 of those jaguar cubs were just born a few months ago. They're incredibly cute. And this program of reintroduction of the area's apex predator has, amazing public and political support. It was local school kids who named the new cubs. And this family, this wasn't the woman or the girl who actually named the cubs, but this girl and her folks came to visit a few months ago, spent the weekend with the team, our team, learning about how there was a synergy of when you work to create new national park lands and to reintroduce missing species and promote related ecotourism, how those efforts could have synergistically positive results for nature and people. Did anybody happen to catch who this gentleman might be? Look familiar? He looks different when he's dressed down. That's President Mauricio Macri and the First Lady of Argentina, who came and spent the weekend learning about the rewilding program at the Ibarra. Leadership at a high level matters to these efforts. And these success stories, I want to suggest to you, are very tangible, direct, and I think replicable examples of public-private collaboration that can help fight climate change, can help secure beauty, can help sustain biodiversity, and help create local economic vitality as a consequence of conservation. For years, our team in Chile has been promoting the idea of a regional branding campaign that would frame economic progress, again, in this way, as linked to wildlands conservation. And this Route of Parks campaign has now been widely adopted by the government. It was launched recently, got so much traffic, it crashed the initial server. So now that I am 20 minutes or so into my talk and have but 10 minutes left, and we wrap up, I'm going to suggest something else. I've just spent a whole lot of time giving you happy stories and showing you beautiful pictures. Isn't conservation easy? Doesn't everyone love it all the time, every place? Would it were so. None of these stories, not a park in Pennsylvania, not a park in Patagonia, or any place in between, none of those success stories are possible without the legal and economic and philanthropic and political scaffolding that makes conservation possible, that was built upon those ideas that emerged from what? Where did this idea about land conservation even come from? It was a reaction to a dark and disturbing history, the way that industrialization and agricultural settlement had swept across North America, which by the mid-1800s had caused the hills of my region of New England to be stripped of their forest cover and filled with grazing sheep. The deforestation in New England and the introduction of livestock, non-native livestock, and the decimation of the indigenous populations, that whole story that happened in the American Northeast, the exact same process happened in Patagonia. Exactly the same. It just happened a little bit later. It got there a little bit later. And in the North American edition of that story, two things happened. There was this myth of superabundance, the idea that nature is inexhaustible, the riches will always be here, we can always move around a little farther down. You combine that myth of superabundance with a sort of an ethic of conquest, and this is what you get. A decimation of wildlife populations. This is one of the most famous photos in American conservation history. This is a mountain of bison skulls. By the mid-1870s, it was profitable. There were so many bison skulls in the Great Plains, it was profitable to gather them up and ship them back east. That's a Detroit rail yard where they could be ground into fertilizer. So the threats to wilderness and wildlife by that time were already plain, as well as were the opportunities to protect America's natural splendor or spectacles, like the geological curiosities of Yellowstone. So can anyone name this painting? Anyone know this painting? Nobody? Okay. Well, this is John Gast's 1872 painting, American Progress. So what was our idea of American progress in 1872? There's the embodied spirit of American progress. She's wafting over the prairie. She's showing a lot of leg, seems to be in grave danger of a wardrobe malfunction while she's carrying the telegraph wire. And what is being displaced? The indigenous bison, the self-willed creatures, the indigenous land-based cultures, making room for the miner and the plowman, the telegraph, and the agricultural settlement. So that was our idea in 1872 of American progress. What else happened in 1872? The world's first national park, Yellowstone, is designated. So conservation as a body of ideas, and then that scaffolding of tools and tactics to implement it, emerged in effect as an antidote to a particular idea of American progress that left a trail of damage to people and to nature. And so for 150 years now, we've been building upon that framework of tools and tactics and ideas, and we've gotten to about 14% of the Earth's land surface now in some form of protected areas, which is a pretty darn good start. And the level of ambition for conservation, including this idea that if we're serious about mitigating climate chaos, and if we're serious about stopping human-caused extinction, we need to secure about at least half of the Earth's surface, land and water, in some form of protected areas. This idea of half Earth that E.O. Wilson has described. That is a very ambitious and bold goal, and it only will happen, literally, from Pennsylvania to Vermont to Patagonia, place by place, acre by acre, incrementally, initiative by initiative. And that is what I wanted to stress as I finish up here, is that I have shown you pictures of grand, wild, extraordinary places with amazing wildlife. But that shouldn't only be our vision of what conservation is. We need more wild places that are small, that are in our communities and around them and next to them. We need conservation at all scales if we're going to incrementally move toward a half-Earth vision. And those places, the little places that we live by, the wild lands that we have access to, help to form not just the food and oxygen and the supply of commodities that we need to support our human economies, but they form the overarching community to which we belong physically and cognitively and spiritually. And we make that happen. That is, through our individual and collective actions, land conservation offers us a practical, direct, tangible way to do something to counter the negative ecological and social trends we see in the world. They offer us an opportunity not to just help rewild the earth, but to rewild ourselves. And that work rebuts old narratives about dominion and offers a new story about communion and reciprocity. The actual places, the protected areas that result from that work, are places to remember our deepest longings for connection and for kinship, places to seek and experience what Mary Oliver described, that formless yet palpable it, that thing that we can sense, the thing that is beautiful and wild and whole. In efforts to create protected areas of all sizes, of all kinds, literally from Pennsylvania to Patagonia, are a means to expand justice and to achieve the future that we would seek, a future that's characterized by beauty and integrity and wildness and freedom with liberty and habitat for all. Thank you very much.
Let's all go up. Thank you, Tom. I must say I am intrigued by this idea of each of us rewilding ourselves. So hold that thought as our conversation unfolds this morning. That was great. Thanks, Tom, for the visual stimulation and for this provocative story. And I'd like to now turn to Larry Seltzer, President and CEO of the Conservation Fund, to provide some additional context for the topics that Tom introduced and for his own experience working at the intersection of economic activity and environmental principles. Larry?
Kathy, thank you. And first of all, let me congratulate you, Tom. It was a terrific presentation, and it's magnificent work in a part of the world that I have yet to visit, but here I am in Pittsburgh. And I think if I read the slide correctly, the next stop from Pittsburgh is Patagonia. So I think I'm on the right track. What I want to do is spend just a few minutes this morning talking to you about conservation in a different context. And I operate in the conservation world here in the United States, not internationally, but across all 50 states. And I want you to think about the difference between what Tom was describing in that magnificent landscape and that magnificent outcome, the difference in context and scale and the role of public and private institutions between Chile and then now Argentina and the United States. In many ways, what Tom was describing was sort of the opportunity we had in this country beginning in 1872, but really catching fire when Teddy Roosevelt was president, when we identified wild lands and we drew lines on a map and we identified them as national parks and national wildlife refuges and national forests. And that was a long time ago, and thank goodness he did it. And now the national park system in the United States has been emulated in over 190 countries around the world. But conservation today in the United States is a little different. We're an industrialized country, and while it's a vast country, we have 350 million people in this country, and we're on our way to 600 million people by the turn of the century. It is largely a developed place. Even the wildlands are significantly affected by human impact. Now, the Conservation Fund was started about 35 years ago. We came out of a larger organization called the Nature Conservancy, and our primary mission was to buy land for conservation. And yet we were doing it in a particular way, which was to work on behalf of public agencies, federal, state, and local. And they would identify what lands they felt were important to protect. And then we would serve as their acquisition agent. We would mobilize the public and private money necessary to complete the transactions, but not be the ultimate steward of the land. It would go to the National Park Service or the state of Pennsylvania or Allegheny County. And over the last 34 years, we protected 8.5 million acres across the 50 United States with that model. The challenge going forward is that public policy, public sentiment about protecting land and wild land is in a state of flux in this country. We're not developing new national parks, or at least not very many. And what we need to, what the public policy is driving toward is more what happens between those big protected blocks of land. National park, national wildlife refuge, national forest. And Tom referred to this as the core wildlands buffered by larger landscapes that provide connectivity but allow for economic activity. And increasingly, in my 35 years in this field, I'm seeing a lot of energy and financial resources flow toward those lands that lie between the big public protected areas. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one particular example and the role that the local charity, the Richard King Mellon Foundation, has played in that space. And that has to do with large, intact, working forests. These are the forests not owned by a public agency, owned for over 100 years by the big integrated pulp and paper companies. About 15 years ago, they started selling this land. And over the span of about 10 or 11 years, they sold 90 million acres of forest land. It's the largest transfer of private lands in the history of the United States. Something that the conservation community was wholly unprepared for. Philanthropy was wholly outgunned. And in 90 million acres changing hands, less than 2 million acres was acquired for conservation. In fact, 20 million acres was lost right off the top to development. No longer growing trees, now growing houses or shopping centers. It has come out of productive use, and all of the ecological values of large, intact forests were lost. Fortunately, a new class of owner emerged. These are investor owners. They don't own manufacturing plants. They don't make 2x4s. They don't make paper. They just view timber as an asset class, a financial asset, an investable asset. And they aggregated money from pension funds, from university endowments, from foundation endowments, and they acquired 70 million of the 90 million acres of land. The good news is that's a lot of land, 70 million acres still intact, large ecosystems, watersheds, providing all of those public interest values still there. The bad news is they view it as an asset class. It's an investment, and a short-term investment, 10, 11, maybe 12 years, at which time they are going to return capital back to the investors. And as they do that, they are under a federal law that governs pension fund investments that says you have to maximize financial return. You don't have a choice in that matter. Timber generates about a 5% return. They took the money promising 15% rates of return. How do you explain the difference? Well, it's based on the speculative value of developing that land. Not forests, shopping centers, houses, second homes. So where does that lead you? It leads you on an inexorable march towards subdivision, fragmentation of the forest. And once it's fragmented, it loses its ecological value and it loses its economic value. And then the next step is conversion to non-forest uses. The expression, see, when you harvest trees, then you let them grow again and you harvest, that's called a rotation. And the expression is asphalt, the last rotation. So over the last 10, 11 years, we've lost another 20 million acres of forest land in this country to development. Now you're down to 50 million acres, 90 to 70 to 50. All 50 million acres will come on the market in the next 10 to 15 years. We know this because we know who owns it. We know the structure in which they own it. And so how do you step up and address that challenge, the largest land conservation challenge in the history of the United States. How do you address those 50 million acres where the majority of our drinking water comes from? Magnificent habitat for any number of species, outdoor recreation opportunities, carbon sinks. We can't possibly address climate change in this country if we lose those forests. How do you step up when philanthropy simply can't, or traditional models of philanthropy can't keep pace, and there isn't a Doug Tompkins or Chris Tompkins to step in and buy the whole thing? First of all, you couldn't afford to. This land sells for about $1,500 an acre. You can do the math at 50 million acres. There isn't that kind of money. Public policy isn't aimed at new national parks. If we could set that aside as wildlands, forget the fact that there are whole communities that depend on that for economic value. If you could set it aside, it might be a wonderful thing to do. But that's fantasy. There isn't enough money to do that. There isn't the political will to do that. And so we formed a joint venture with the Richard King Mellon Foundation, which, by the way, has conserved more land in the United States than any other charity in the history of the country, far more than the Rockefellers ever did, almost 3x. So they're just quiet about it. So if you ever see them on the street, you should thank them. It's well over 4 million acres that they've protected in this country. But we partnered with the foundation to develop a new model, a model that could go to scale in the time frame that was required, that could move at the speed of business with the sophistication of business and try and keep these lands intact. Now, we call it the Working Forest Fund. We're not as good at marketing as what's going on in Patagonia. But it is an accurate representation. In other words, we viewed the conservation of these lands to include the economic activity, to include the people in the communities who depend on that economic activity. It is not rewilding, although that is a magnificent outcome. It is really the preservation or the conservation of an extant model of land with an overlay that prevents fragmentation, prevents bad harvesting practices, and the forest products industry was guilty of every bad practice you can imagine, that allows for sustainable forestry, but protects the public interest values that I care about and that many of you may care about forever. Now, how did we do that? Well, we looked at those timber investment companies. They were very small operations. They had no manufacturing, so they had low overhead. They went out to the pension funds and they said, why don't you give us $100 million and you give us $100 million and you give us $100 million. We'll go buy these assets, we'll manage them for you, and then we'll return capital. The problem with that model is very efficient, but the product is not a conserved working forest. The product is a shopping center or housing development. We didn't like the product, but we liked the machine they built. And so we went to the Richard King Mellon Foundation and said, we want to build a nonprofit version of one of those timber investment companies. Here's what it would look like. And we want you to be the money coming in on the front end. And because it's your money and not money that expects a market rate return, we can have a different product come out the back end. And the product is going to be a permanently protected forest that also protects the jobs and the tax base in these rural communities. And that model resonated with them. And since that time, we have acquired almost 500,000 acres of timberland across the United States in 15 states. It's all in the tax rolls. It's all being harvested. The jobs and the tax base are intact. And yet it's all being managed for sustainable forestry. It's a complicated set of facts and figures, but essentially, you're not cutting more than is growing. You're leaving different age stands because wildlife, particularly migratory birds, like different age stands. And ultimately, all of that land will have a conservation easement put on it that prevents subdivision, prevents bad forestry, and then will be sold back into the private market. And that's how we recover all of the investment, and then we go and do it again. There's never been anything like this before in the United States, and it was only the courage and vision of the Richard King Mellon Foundation that allowed this model to go forward. I will tell you, we're at 600,000 acres now. By the end of 2021, we'll be at 1.6 million, and by the end of the next decade, we'll be at 5 million acres. Why is 5 million acres important? Because the U.S. Forest Service has looked at that 50 million acre block of land and said 10% of that is of exceptionally high conservation value. That's what needs to be protected. That's a $5.5 billion investment in land. And no model of traditional philanthropy or private philanthropy can touch that without some new mechanism that begins to integrate the tools of the marketplace with the ideals and the outcomes of conservation. That's a model for conservation that can go to scale in this country, in this context, where the land is privately owned, where land values are very high. You can't buy land in the way Pennsylvania did at the turn of the century for $2 an acre. It costs you $2,000 an acre. And so how do you achieve scale? How do you move forward when a model of philanthropy, a model of public policy, has become an anachronism, something that's nice to have, but insufficient for moving forward? What I would suggest to you is that as we think about conservation in the future, as we think about scale, as we think about public interest values, and as we think about public policy, conservation requires all kinds of new models. The large, intact, vast wildlands that we saw in Patagonia, magnificently protected by some superheroes. But it also requires new models that don't look like that aren't rewilding, that have wild components in them, but also include people, communities, economic activity. Because otherwise, we're going to end up, in this country at least, with isolated islands of wildness, surrounded by vast seas of development. That doesn't work economically, it doesn't work ecologically, and won't achieve the kind of outcome that I think we all hope for, at least in this country. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful. And so from that idea of a different kind of philanthropic model, let's turn to Karen to give us the hyper-local perspective, if we might.
Yes, thanks, Tom and Larry. Both of you are doing such wonderful, inspiring work, and I love the half-Earth model. That's just amazing. But I want to talk about the even littler places than Larry was talking about. The work of my organization, the Allegheny County Parks Foundation, is focused on protecting and restoring nature closer to where people are living in Allegheny County, the second most populous county in Pennsylvania. We're a nonprofit organization that partners with the Allegheny County Parks Department to raise private sector dollars to undertake projects, both recreational and ecological, in the Allegheny County Park system. The Allegheny County Parks are 9 in number, a total of just over 12,000 acres, which is a lot of land, but it's only 2.5% of Allegheny County's land area. So it's not even close to half of the county. But it's one of the larger metropolitan park systems in the country. We have 9 parks, the largest of which is 3,000 acres, South Park. The smallest is 500 acres, Harrison Hills Park. And they ring the city of Pittsburgh. None of them are in the city limits of Pittsburgh, but they form kind of a ring around the city in the suburban areas. When the first 2 parks were acquired in the 1920s, Pittsburgh was an industrial boom town, and the leaders of the region saw that the citizens of a very polluted city needed places to go to get some respite from the air and water pollution that was being generated by the heavy industrial development of that time. In that era, when not everyone had cars, trolley lines went out to North and South Parks, the first 2 parks. There were families would go out on Sunday with picnics, and they would enjoy the cleaner air and the natural environment of these parks, which the first two, South and North Park, were built kind of to give you the idea that you were in a national park. The landscape architecture of the time was naturalistic stoneworks, and a lake was built in North Park. There was plans for a lake in South Park, which was never built, but there were lots of features, and the county commissioners of the day even brought in buffalo and Indians to populate the parks, to give people the impression that they were in the Wild West. Well, the buffaloes still live in South Park, but the Native Americans are long gone. They didn't really like the winters in Pittsburgh. One of my board members was a Boy Scout in South Park, camping as Boy Scouts do, and he remembers thinking he was in Montana when he was in South Park. The next 6 county parks were added in the 1950s when the visionary county commissioners of that time saw the rapid post-war development of suburban parts of Allegheny County, and they realized at the time that if they did not secure additional land for county parks, which were going to be needed eventually, if they didn't acquire that land at that time, it would be financially impossible to do it, maybe even legally impossible to do it in the future. So interestingly, the Richard King Mellon Foundation assisted Allegheny County in the 50s to buy the next 6 county parks, and then later a park was added in the 1970s, the last one being Heartwood Acres. Most of this land was farmland, or some of it was timberland that had been cut over, or coal mine land, in some cases tracts of land were all of that, and they weren't in very good shape. They were kind of looking like the pictures that Tom showed us of the bison skulls and the denuded sheep farms of Patagonia. But they were developed with a variety of facilities to meet the recreational needs of the day: swimming, tennis, golf, fishing, that kind of thing. And the natural parts of the park, the forests, were kind of left to their own devices. Today, at least 60% of the county park land is more natural in nature, but because it's adjacent to continuing suburbanizing land and land not in very good condition, it's threatened by forest diseases, pests, invasive species, and so even though we have what looks like woodland in these parks, not all of it is in very good ecological shape, and is likely not to be able to be left to its own devices to recover nature. Some level of management is going to be necessary in these lands if we're going to improve the natural aspects of the park over time. Until very recently, Allegheny County paid very little attention to these natural areas of the park. There was no expertise on county staff, but that is changing. That we now have a cadre of county park rangers whose job it is started out to be the friendly face of the parks, but because of their training as naturalists and natural scientists, they have taken on a very important educational role of the public about the natural features of the park, and they've even begun to look at the conditions of the park. For example, our trail systems are just everywhere, bowls of spaghetti in our parks that fragment even the forest areas and create erosion problems and water quality problems. We at the Allegheny County Parks Foundation found a receptive interest in the philanthropic community in funding some ecological assessments of the parks to take a look at what could be done, what the issues and problems were, and even where the good condition parts of the parks were that we could conserve and further protect. So with philanthropic dollars, we partnered with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. I'm really glad to see some folks from the Conservancy here to use their expertise to go out in the parks and tell us what could be done to protect and improve nature in these parks. We have 4 completed plans now out of the 9 parks. We hope to find additional philanthropic dollars to do the remaining 5 parks, but those 4 parks now have blueprints for the kinds of implementation projects that can be done to improve the quality of these parks, including planting more native species of trees, turning turf land into meadows and reforestation projects, doing riparian plantings to improve the water quality of the creeks that flow through some of our parks. So we've got a whole litany of things that we can do, and we're finding an appetite in the funding community, both corporate and philanthropic, and even to some extent individual, to fund these projects. People care about the quality of nature in the parks in Allegheny County and want to see them improved. These ecological assessments and action plans have also had the effect of further informing the county parks department and the county administration about the value of nature. I have to say, 4 years ago when I came to the foundation, there just wasn't kind of a sensibility about the importance of the natural parts of the parks. The county was focused more on maintaining the swimming pools and the tennis courts and thinking about what the new recreational activities were that people were going to be demanding, like pickleball, which I'd never heard of before, and disc golf and things like that. But there is really much more interest now in nature and understanding how the natural functioning ecosystems enhance the experience of the park user in the parks. So I love the idea of freedom, liberty, and habitat for all. That's a fabulous, fabulous statement, which I'm going to adopt and use, if you don't mind. So although the Allegheny County population is still growing at a pretty slow pace, according to the USGS land use National Land Cover Database, between 2001 and 2019, we've lost green space equivalent to almost twice the acreage of our existing county park system. So in 18 years, we've developed green space in this county. 5% of green space has now been converted to 5% of our land area that wasn't already developed has become developed. Tree Pittsburgh did an analysis of tree canopy loss in the county and found in a 5-year period from 2010 to 2015, we've lost 10,000 acres of tree canopy. So it's amazing to me that as we are not growing very much in population, we are growing a lot in asphalt. Mm-hmm. And I don't see the appetite of county government to add more parkland to what already exists. But that gets me to a project that I want to finish with, where we're thinking about how can we connect the county parks better with non-motorized transportation methods and with wildlife habitat corridors. If we can't add more county parkland, can we at least create connections to both enable wildlife to move from green space to green space and allow people to move around in ways that they can't right now? Although the county parks were established at a time when maybe you could have walked or ridden your bike to them, in today's Allegheny County, it's just far too developed around these parks. The roadways are far too dangerous for any but the most intrepid bicycle riders to get to them. So you have to have a car. There isn't even bus transportation to most of these parks. I did an analysis of that, and except during rush hour on weekdays, you can't get to most of these parks with public transportation, and that's got to change too. But we are working with almost 30 nonprofit and community partner organizations, some of whom are in the room today too, to develop a vision that we're calling right now the Allegheny Green Web. The Green Web is meant to give you the idea of a spider web of connections among the existing green spaces in the county. We started with the idea of connecting the county parks. That was something the county government embraced as a vision, but we've added the idea of connecting also to privately protected tracts of land that have been conserved by the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and Hollow Oak Land Trust and Allegheny Land Trust and all of the other large and small conservancies in the county, to municipal parks that are large enough to have some contingent of green space that is not developed into asphalt surfaces. And we've taken that vision further because we realized as we were drawing our maps of where potential connections could go, that there were lots of green space deserts in our county, lots of places that had been the epicenter of industrial development a century or a half a century ago, but were now communities that had lost that and that had largely brownfields and abandoned properties. So we started mapping how we could connect those green space deserts with the green space oases in our county. And this vision is continuing to evolve. We've started to reach out to municipalities who themselves are thinking about, because they have constituent demand for access through non-motorized transportation to various places in their communities. We're thinking about, all right, how can we bring your vision of recreational trails and commuter trails and connections into our vision of a larger, more diverse set of connections among the green spaces and trails in our county. So that's my story, and I think it's really nice to see the scales and how they might connect over
Absolutely.
time.
Karen, thank you for that perspective. So Karen sounded the thread of scale and how it plays out. We've heard connectivity in each of our speakers and the importance of building infrastructure, enabling funding mechanisms, authorizing public policy environments. But we've heard also varying levels of public commitment and perhaps even public will, communal will, to have these natural spaces accessible. What are some ways that philanthropy can help to build an ethic of conservation that values these wild, semi-wild, or accessible natural spaces and provides both the public funding and the public support for their preservation over time? In other words, ways that philanthropy can help to connect people to the need for and the public support for these kinds of spaces. Is it through activation? Is it through programs?
Well, let me sort of go back to something I mentioned, which is that the Allegheny County Park System now has a system of county park rangers that didn't exist 4 years ago. And that, the county, and there's also a city park ranger program that works in coordination with the county parks. But the Richard King Mellon Foundation actually was the foundation that stepped up and offered to Allegheny County that they would fund the development of that program and fund the salaries of those rangers for a period of time. I think it was 3 years, with the commitment of the county that they would then take over running that program if it were successful. And it has been enormously successful. The county park rangers are bringing a new set of players into the parks and making them appreciate the natural aspects of those parks in a way that hadn't been done before. There's a school to parks, a parks to schools, schools to parks program, for example, where the rangers will take a nature program into a school classroom, and the understanding is then that classroom teacher or that school principal will bring the kids out to the park, and they'll have nature programs in the park. Many of those children have never been in a county park before. So that is a way to begin to expose children and their families to the parks through a lens that may not have been available to them before. And I think there's an opportunity for other philanthropies to use that same model.
But again, it's kind of public-private partnership. It begins with philanthropic capital and is handed back to the public as a responsibility.
Sure, that's exactly right. In the Tompkins conservation context, there was an impetus, an energy, a catalyst of private funding, but the partnerships, all those success stories of those public natural areas are inherently a public-private partnership. No individual or no organization can make a national park. A president or a Congress can do that depending upon your system. And so that partnership is fundamental. But again, sort of in the context of the work that Doug and Chris and their team has accomplished, initially, this is a relatively modestly capitalized family foundation that was able to buy 2 million acres because land values were low. And there were some very large ownerships. But that is not replicable everywhere, certainly. But at that scale, certainly. But at some scales, it still is to buy private lands and assemble it and aggregate it and conserve it under various different status, either as private lands with an easement or repatriate it to public ownership. This is still happening. And as the scale of the Tompkins efforts got larger and larger, it really outstripped their checkbook to do. And therefore, many other philanthropic partners became engaged, both with the development of the infrastructure and some of the outreach programs and those really amazing reintroduction, translocation efforts in the Ibarra watershed. And there's like 65 people working in that program. Biologists, wildlife technicians, veterinarians, there's a quarantine. It's a very, very expensive program to reestablish these wildlife populations. A fellow, what's his name? Leonardo DiCaprio, that's it. The Leo DiCaprio Foundation has been absolutely a crucial partner in supporting that rewilding program work. So it's a lot of partnerships involved.
I want to invite the audience now to raise a question. We'll we have a mic over here, and we'd ask for your question. Sir, are you going over to the mic? Please tell us your name and ask your question.
My name is Sanford Lerba. My question is about, people brought up the concept of rewilding, and we've had neotropical migrants, and monitoring of these neotropical migrants, some of the populations of these birds have dropped by over 50%. And they nest in this area, and if one marker bird is the wood thrush, and if and the concept is if a wood thrush lands on a tree, if the tree is on private land or public land, it doesn't care. And so one of the things is particularly in Allegheny County or Western Pennsylvania or Pittsburgh, is that we have a lot of resources in terms of fertile land, lots of lands that you cannot build houses on because they'll fall down the hill. And so there's plenty of spaces to put, to rewild, to reestablish. And could there be, grants towards private landowners to, and perhaps with an agreement that they would keep the land in a certain way for a certain number of years, to put in more native trees, native shrubs, wildflowers, native grasses, and remove the invasive species to promote, habitat for neotropical migrants and other species.
First of all, thank you for the question. I think it's a terrific set of issues that needs to be addressed. Birds are near and dear to my heart. It was my doorway into the environmental movement when I was younger. And in fact, the decline of most neotropical migrants at 50% is probably grossly understated at the moment. These are the birds that come every spring, and you know, they come to your feeders. And the reality is they have three big buckets of problems. One is where they winter. That's down in Central and South America, and the majority of wood thrushes overwinter in Nicaragua and Panama. And there's habitat loss there. There's habitat loss where they nest, which is here, and then all the bad things that happen to them in between. And there are opportunities for philanthropy to weigh in all across that spectrum, that life cycle, if you will, of those birds. I think specifically what you mentioned, which is bringing back habitat onto private lands. And in fact, there are programs that do that. In fact, there are publicly funded programs, federal funding.
Well, there aren't anything for small landowners. I mean, it's all pretty much for 501c kind of organizations for the most part.
And so part of what we all have to do is express the need collectively in a way that a public policymaker can respond to. Legislation at the federal, state, or even local level is hard to get through, and yet unless the public will is expressed in some enormously powerful way, it gets drowned out by other programs. Part of the challenge in this country is that when you start talking about individual landowners, you're such a fragmented set of constituents that it's very hard to get to scale. There are nonprofits like the National Wildlife Federation, which has a Bringing Back the Birds program, where they will work with private landowners. That's funded by membership and by charity. But I'd like to make a different point here about the role of philanthropy, and really 2 points. One is that the independent sector, the philanthropic sector in this country, came into existence to take the risks that government, the private sector wouldn't and government couldn't, right? It was to fill a breach and to take risk. And in my almost 40 years now in the independent sector, what I have seen most from foundations is a move away from risk-taking toward being risk-averse. And I think it's a fundamental mismatch in what philanthropy was started to do and what they are now doing. And I'm not exactly sure how to fix that, but I believe that the behavior of groups like the Tompkins, like the Richard King Mellon Foundation, where they are willing to use their resources to take risk, to try new things, to do things where they're not sure what the outcome is, where they're pushing boundaries, is the essential role that philanthropy has to play, because public policy on its own is a lagging indicator. Public policy never leads. How long since the time we knew smoking was bad for you before the first anti-smoking regulations came into existence, right? It was decades and decades. Public policy always follows. Philanthropy needs to relearn. We've talked about rewilding. Philanthropy needs to relearn what it means to lead. And there are too few examples of that. Those that stand out because we celebrate them and we can make the most of it. But I think that's across the board an imperative for the sector.
Great. A look at risk.
Good morning. My name is Fitzgerald, and I have 2 questions this morning. The first one is for Mr. Stelzner. It's about the Working Forest Fund. I'm sorry, did you hear me so far?
Yeah.
Yeah, the question's about the Working Forest Fund. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on what happens post-sale of the property after your organization sells it.
Yes, good question. What happens after? Essentially, what we're doing is we look, here's the situation. If you're buying land for a public agency, a huge property in this country is 10,000 acres. That's just a whopper. And it might cost you $50 million to buy that property in a national park. If you're talking about these forested landscapes, that's a small piece. And a big piece might be 250,000 acres, right? And so if you're going to permanently protect the public interest values, so sustainable forestry and water quality, riparian habitat, migratory bird, all of those things that we care about, somehow you have to have an investment to buy those rights. Every property is a bundle of rights. And in this country, beginning in the early 1970s, we created a tool called a conservation easement that allows one to buy certain rights out of that bundle of rights and move them into a different permanent place. Right? A conservation easement can strip off certain rights, the right to develop the property, the right to subdivide the property, the right to overharvest, those get stripped off. But buying those is expensive. So forest land here in Pennsylvania, those rights that you care about are probably about 35% of the value of that land. So if you're buying property at $1,000 an acre, you're going to pay $350 an acre to strip off those rights. But on a property that's 20 or 30 or 40,000 acres, it's a big chunk of money. And it takes time to do that. And so essentially the problem we were solving for was time. Because these properties change hands. Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch sell them in 90 days at auction. You have to have cash. And so we had to figure out a way to intervene to create time so that the public and philanthropic money could come to the table to buy those rights to permanently protect the interest that we cared about in the land. By owning the property, we take it off the market. We can harvest just enough trees to pay the taxes. We're a nonprofit. We don't have any profit margin. And that buys time, because now we can hold that property for as long as it takes for the public agencies and the philanthropies to come forward. Once the easement is sold, it's a perpetual easement, then we can sell that land back to any buyer. It doesn't really matter who buys it, because their activities are forever governed by that easement, which is designed by the public agencies who are trying to protect certain values. They paid for it. And so the land moves, essentially we're laundering property through our ownership. In honor of El Chapo, we're laundering money through our ownership in order to buy time to allow the conservation money to come to the table. Once that's in place, we sell the land back to a private buyer who has to manage it in a sustainable fashion, and we recover the money and we can go and do it again. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And is the easement held by your organization or
No.
partner organizations?
We're not in the stewardship business. We're really a transaction organization. We're like the investment bank for conservation. There are lots of institutions better prepared to hold and monitor that easement. There are 1,400 land trusts in this country, and they care passionately about their local geographies, state agencies, and in some cases, federal agencies.
Sure. Thank you. And my second question is for everyone. It's simply, what are some of the ways that we as independent citizens and small business owners can help contribute to some of the causes that you mentioned today?
Two ways. Obviously, it's wonderful to write a check. And Americans are the most generous people in the world. And thank goodness they are across all causes. I think while that has real-time impact, it has a less lasting effect at the type of scale that we need to move this world in a more sustainable way. I would say voting is probably your most powerful lever that you can pull, no pun intended. And too few people vote in this country, and even fewer vote on the basis of nature. And until we reverse that, until nature becomes something absolutely central to how we make decisions, how we manage our economy, we're fighting a rearguard action. That's my...
I couldn't agree with that more. And one sort of thing that we should stress about this tradition of wildlands philanthropy is it's not just for Rockefellers and Mellons anymore. No. The democratization of conservation giving through the explosion of the land trust movement is really one of the most heartening things in American public life. It's still thoroughly bipartisan. If you go to the National Land Conservation Rally, you see the tofu-loving people from Vermont, tree huggers from Vermont, and the guys from the Colorado Cattlemen's Land Trust with the big hats. You know, so it is really extraordinary to see the energy and still the bipartisan nature of conservation, people caring about their place, willing to talk about it, willing to make contributions, even if those are modest financially, and of time and energy and political engagement.
I'll just follow up with one thing. You may have seen this. I know you all are keenly interested in every little thing that happens in Washington, D.C. Yesterday, the Senate voted 92-8 to permanently reauthorize the primary funding source for land conservation in this country. It's called the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That now has to be taken up by the House, and if there's something you can do today, tomorrow, and the next day, is contact your representatives and tell them to vote for the Senate package, and it will be signed by the President. There's probably no more important thing that can be done in the next week and a half, 2 weeks, for the future of this country, in my opinion.
Well, and let me chime in and say it's not just at the federal level that we need to be focused on the politics of conservation and conservation funding. I don't think our county council or our county executive or municipal elected officials hear very often about how important nature and nature conservation is to their citizens, and that needs to be expressed.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Hi, my name is Christina Schmidlap, and in thinking about questions of scale, I'm wondering if you think that climate change perversely will be in the next few decades a motivation for government to act at a more comprehensive level and to perhaps find a public safety aspect of justifying increased federal action to protect land. I know you pointed out how public policy tends to lag behind, but could it be that the only way to preserve enough land to get at all towards this half-Earth thing, governments will have to act comprehensively, and that climate change could help them do that?
I can go, or you can go first.
Well, first of all, thanks for the question. It's a great one. There's a quote that's often attributed to Winston Churchill, although I've since read that he didn't say it, which is that Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And whether he said it or not, the point remains. I have, this is going to sound funny, but I have mixed feelings about climate change. Obviously, it is an existential threat for us here in this country. It's an existential threat for our planet. We need to do something about it. I am skeptical that in the absence of huge crises and dislocation, that public policy will lead. That's just not the way the American system works. The citizenry can lead. Philanthropy can empower people to lead. There's a collaboration there that needs to grow and be stronger. But when I say I'm of mixed emotions about climate change, what's happened in this country, and this goes back to philanthropy, is, and some of this is a result of ongoing discussions and inability of our government agencies or our government to act on climate change. Part of it is a reaction to the current administration in Washington right now. But hundreds of millions of dollars are flowing into advocacy around climate change. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that's not a good thing. But what's happened is that it has essentially dried up the funding to conserve the land that would allow, for example, species to migrate or habitat to migrate, which is going to happen. This is not the first time we've had climate change. You go back 15,000 years, we had an ice age and it retreated. And species and habitat moved up and down the coast of California because there wasn't anything to block it. And unfortunately now we have San Diego and Los Angeles and what have you. And so focusing on making sure that we keep development, whether it's large intact working forests or not, keep development out of those migratory corridors for habitat that we are going to need as tree species move north and species follow them. And so I think we're being short-sighted. We're putting so much money into fighting the devil we know, the administration or the congressman or the senator or the industry, and instead not taking the long-term action which would provide us optionality in the future. And I think we have to have a more balanced approach here. So yes, we need public policy, and that will only happen if the American people decide it should happen. But at the same time, philanthropy should take a more holistic view.
I agree with almost all of that, but I want to amplify the one point. I absolutely share that skepticism that these changes are going to be driven by public policy, which is reactive. And I also bemoan the fact that in the philanthropic sector a decade ago, there was this huge rush away from conservation, biodiversity protection, wildlife focus to energy policy and climate issues. A huge sectoral shift. And it was quite short-sighted in the fact that this magical technology that people in labs around the world are trying to figure out how to take atmospheric carbon dioxide out of the air and do that in some way. Well, it already exists. It's called a tree. It exists. And if you can keep enough trees in wild grasslands or semi-wild areas, you can sequester a lot of natural carbon. When you take a landscape like the Chacabuco Valley and convert it from an overgrazed, eroded grassland, you build a natural carbon sequestration in the soil as that area rewilds. That is a huge part of solving the climate question. And unfortunately, our public policy has lagged on that. I bemoan also, not that I am opposed to any of those conservation advocacy groups that work on policy engagement, but it is a crucial need to have revenue streams to protect land. And very interesting research I just saw on this presented here in Pittsburgh at the last Land Conservation Rally, Land Trust Alliance Rally, a polling firm, social science research firm, kind of Democrat and Republican, left-leaning, testing attitudes across the spectrum, different parts of the country, on natural climate solutions. It's another thing where you get very broad bipartisan support from the hunters in Alabama who say, well, wait a second, you can help solve climate change by protecting some land where I can go hunt and fish? To the folks in Berkeley, natural climate solutions is something where you can actually build a potent political constituency around. And that's just protect places that have all these ancillary benefits as well, as in addition to climate change mitigation.
Hi, thanks everyone. I'm Caitlin Hanel. I'm a graduate student in the communication department here, and I'm writing my dissertation about Pittsburgh's regional parks. So I'm reading a lot about restoration, and I was really interested in the idea of rewilding. And I was wondering how you see terms like rewilding, restoration, recovery as either building upon one another, different from one another, or reinforcing one another, what that kind of says about the trajectory of environmental conservation.
So restoration, rewilding, what was the other one?
Recovery.
Recovery.
Yeah.
Okay, well, when the field of ecological restoration emerged as a sort of academic and practical discipline in the 1980s, and you had a couple of refereed technical journals in that field that were beginning to be published, ecological restoration was really based on sites, brownfields, places that have been badly damaged, but localized, specific places. And so the tools and tactics started to be applied to restore degraded areas. When the term rewilding was introduced into the literature, I actually know this because I was working in the Conservation Journal in which the word first appeared, and my mentor in conservation was the one who coined it. He used it as a synonym for large-scale wilderness recovery, landscape-scale wilderness recovery, and specifically including the idea of the reintroduction or resurrection of viable populations of large carnivores and other keystone species. And then the first technical articles that were published in the academic literature about rewilding were about the loss and recovery of apex predators and trophic cascades. Over the last couple of decades, as the term rewilding has spread around the world, it has become sort of generic shorthand for everything in every way that people can help nature heal. And people use it in a lot of different ways. With the Rewilding Europe folks are thinking a little differently than we are in South America. People are doing rewilding projects in Africa, a little bit different. But in a holistic way, it's simply, I use it to mean now large-scale wildlands recovery and helping nature heal. The most recent example I saw of a vegan beer hall outside Boston named Rewild. So there you can go actually buy your vegan dinner and drink a local brew and rewild yourself at the brew club. It's a big meme now, and you can use it in a lot of different ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel. My name is Lisa Brown, and I'm the Executive Director of Watersheds of South Pittsburgh. And my question, I'm going to move to the micro level for you folks. What happens, or have you ever experienced a situation where, for instance, we have in Pittsburgh where we have leadership that is really interested in conservation and ecology in our city, and yet the bureaucratic mechanisms are far less progressive. They're from the Middle Ages. And so when you're trying to enact change, you may have the folks up here saying, oh yeah, we're all for that, but then when you start to work with the bureaus and departments on this level, you hit one brick wall after another. And so my question for you folks is, have you ever experienced that, and how do you maneuver around those issues?
Well, first of all, I'm assuming when you talk about the Middle Ages, you're not referring to your 40s and 50s. I just want to know where I fit in the spectrum here.
More like 50s and 60s.
You know, I think that situation, frankly, is not unique to government agency bureaucracies. I think it's the nature of bureaucracies. And it's true in philanthropies, it's true in nonprofits, it's true in for-profits. If you've studied any organizational behavior, the organization at some point is about self-preservation and not about breaking new ground. But breaking new ground is hard. Actually doing something is hard. It involves risk. What I will tell you is that bureaucracies, you can't get things done without them, and yet the challenge is to figure out how to move them. And if your elected officials really believed what they said, when they said, oh, I'm all for parks, or I'm all for this, they can make it happen. The bureaucracies work for the elected people. And the problem is that we don't hold people accountable. They say we elect them based, 90% of elections are pocketbook issues and not other issues, and we're here talking about other issues. And then even those folks who get elected based on nature or reconnecting young people with nature or whatever the issue is, we don't hold them accountable. And you've all seen the statistic that the American people have about an 18% approval rating of Congress, but they like their congressperson. That sort of cognitive dissonance is why we let bureaucracies do what they do. There's no accountability. So until we're going to mobilize the way we have done in the past around civil rights, the way we did around smoking, the way we did around certain conflicts around the world, until we're prepared to mobilize in that fashion, then I think we have only ourselves to blame.
I want to tell a little story if I have a
Yeah,
minute
you do.
here. So I work with Allegheny County. It's not one of the more recalcitrant bureaucracies in the world, but there's a level of what, when I led a bureaucracy at the state level, we called hard pan, which was that civil service level where they're going to do what they did for the last 30 years. So I think we had a success because we had the vision as the nonprofit partner of the county to find some money and to do a project that the county thought was worthless. We said we want to turn a 5-acre mowed turf steep slope in Boyce Park into a wildflower and native grass meadow. And what did we want to do that for? Well, you know, we want to diversify the habitat, blah, blah, blah. Well, okay. We worked with the park staff. We worked with the staff in Pittsburgh, in the county office building. We built a beautiful meadow with county workers who, you know, some of them were really excited about it. In July, that meadow was all over Instagram. It was a gorgeous display of black-eyed, brown-eyed Susans, coreopsis, with native grasses coming up and other wildflowers coming up, but it was spectacular. And when we took the county executive and his staff to see it, he said, oh my gosh, this is like coming through the tunnel from the airport at night to see the city of Pittsburgh. And you know what? There's going to be at least one meadow in every county park now because the public loved it. So if you can find some way to create things that are visible and the public is excited about, that can be a hook for getting the bureaucracy to care. There's a lot of commitment now that didn't exist a few years ago to, I think rewilding is probably going to be a little bit of a stretch for us, but restoring some of the areas of our parks.
Thank you.
Well, it falls to me to bring our conversation. Did you have one question?
Hi, my name is Karen too, Karen. And just what you were saying was making me think of something. Like, how do we rewild our children? Because I think if we look at the future of everything, and you talk about voting, kids, like when I was a kid, I could walk down to the woods. My mother would give me a lunch and say, scram for 12 hours. We called it the Mine Woods. Right now it's Monroeville Mall. We had flowers, we had mayflowers, we had violets, we had all this stuff, we had streams, and we just took it for granted, and then it went away. Some of these kids never get to just walk out their door and do that. They have to have their parents drive them to a park, which is really nice. But how do we get little kids and teenagers excited about nature when it doesn't exist in walking distance, where, you know, they have to always be transported, which, like you said, it's really hard to get to the parks. That's what I'm worried about. I don't know if you have any ideas of how to get that to happen for kids.
Well, there are land conservation organizations, local, regional, and national, that focus on that, on making accessible places for people to recreate in. A Trust for Public Land and many, you know, local initiatives like you're describing. So it is a tough nut, though. I mean, I live in a rural area. I've got a teenager who can literally walk outside, swim in the pond, or wander through the woods, or go up in the town forest and go mountain biking. And what does he do? He mostly does this. He's got those two thumbs working. So it is a cultural challenge and an access challenge. But a whole lot of more land conservation that is, again, embedded in human communities, adjacent, within walking or biking distance, and a lot of semi-wild scraps of nature. When you're 8 years old, you don't need 10 million acres in Patagonia. What you need is a little patch of woods with some trees to play in outside. And the commitment of the community to make that acceptable and safe for you.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's a fabulous issue. I would add a couple of things to what Tom has said. First of all, if you look at what's going on in this country, there are some fundamental demographic shifts underway. And 100 years ago, 85% of Americans lived in rural areas. They were connected to nature by definition. By the year 2050, 85% of Americans will live in big cities. It's a complete reversal. And on top of that, by the year 2042 now, according to the latest census, for the first time, will be a majority-minority country. And so you have these profound, fundamental demographic shifts underway. We are becoming blacker, browner, and more urban as an American population. And yet we have an environmental movement that grew up white, suburban, and wilderness-oriented. And as a result, much of the activity in the environmental space has been about bringing people to nature. And nature was always described, no offense about rewilding, I'm all for this, but this is a larger rhetorical point, that nature was defined as wilderness, something pristine and far away. And the reality, the result of that is that for many Americans today, nature is like some foreign country that if you're lucky, you might get to visit once in your life. And that is not going to work. Given those fundamental demographic shifts, we need to reverse that. And instead of bringing young people to nature, we need to bring, as Tom was just suggesting, we need to bring nature to young people. And that means bringing it back into the urban environment. It's where the people are. And only by experiencing nature and something that's nearby and accessible will they develop the love for something that when they get to go to Yellowstone or Patagonia, they truly can love and appreciate that. There's a lot of this is happening right now. If you haven't read it, you should read a spectacular book called The Last Child in the Woods, written by a friend of mine named Richard Louv. And he coined this phrase, nature deficit disorder, but essentially he cataloged all of these things that are going on, separating young people from nature, and then offering solutions, and in later editions of the book, highlighting things that are being done. But it's a terrific way to crystallize a community and organizations' approach to reconnecting young people. But unless we do that, it's a pretty tough slog.
Well, let's end on that note. It's my sad task to bring this discussion to a close, but I hope the conversation will continue in our community. This has been a very, very rich discussion this morning where we've enriched our vocabularies. We have some new words. We've once again been reminded of the importance of voting and participation civically, of the value of raising our voices, whether collectively or in different ways, to engage in policy discussions and in our own communities. And also we've been exhorted to take a view that embraces the long term, that this is the long game, and that by bringing nature to people wherever they are, we can do so much for the planet, but also for the soul and meaning of our own community. So I want to thank all three of you for the rich way that you helped to expand our thinking about a conversation that must continue in our community. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now, for those of you who've been with us before, you know that we like to send our speakers and respondents off with a small token of our gratitude that is usually an image of a local philanthropist who aligns with their work. And so in your case, Tom, we want to send you back to Vermont with an image of somebody whose impact can be seen just steps from our doorway here. And that philanthropist is Mary Shenley. And so Mary Shenley is an individual who scandalized Pittsburgh at the age of 16. So we have it all. We have scale and we have scandal this morning. She eloped at the age of 16 to England, but she never forgot the value of green space, particularly in a town which at that point had the unflattering reputation of being known as hell with the lid off. And so Mary Shenley's gift of 300 acres created Shenley Park, also the land on which Carnegie Institute or the Carnegie Museum sit. And so we want you to take this image of Mary Shenley back to Vermont and let it always be a reminder of our conversation here today and the value of having green space where people are and where they can love it throughout time. So thank you very much.
I'm so pleased to know of another Wildlands Philanthropy story, and one here in your
Right.
region. And I'll treasure it always.
Good, thanks so
Thank you.
much. And Larry, you don't get to go away without an image yourself. And so please take back to Washington the image of another woman from our region. Exactly, no scandal here, but scale. All right, she represents scale, and she's the philanthropist Constance Mellon. And so she was the chairwoman of the Richard King Mellon Foundation from its inception until her death in 1980, and patiently, in ways that only you and members of that family and the staff of RK Mellon know, that entity has secured more than 4 million acres in novel and important ways that benefit our planet and our region. And so please take her image with you, not only as a memento of our time together, but of your work with them and your connection to our region. Thank you. And so Karen, for you, of course, who else would we connect you with? But we'd offer another image of Mary Shenley. It just seems so fitting that her gift of this park and her responsiveness to a civil servant, George Bigelow, who raced to England when he learned that developers were coming to London to try to buy the acreage that he wanted for a park, and she responded to the needs of the city of Pittsburgh. And so for that responsiveness and your leadership in the parks movement and in the public policy domain and philanthropy, please take Mary Shenley back with you.
Thank you, Kathy. That's
Thanks a lot.
lovely.
So I want to offer my thanks to my partners, Anne-Marie Tockett and Marisa Escoveda, and to our friends at Grantmakers of Western Pennsylvania and the Allegheny Parks Foundation, and so many of you who helped us build this great audience today and have this wonderful discussion. Thank you. Live philanthropically. Thanks again. Bye-bye.